365 days of war, and the grim toll of human suffering in Ukraine, Russia, and beyond keeps rising. Tens of thousands of soldiers from both sides have died on the front lines. And as towns, cities, and villages across Ukraine come under Russian fire, people endured the pain and despair of losing their loved ones. More than 7,000 civilians have now been killed in Ukraine, including in areas occupied by Russian forces. Millions of mostly women and children have been uprooted from their families and comforts of their homes to shelter from the war. And yet there's no prospect of peace. I'm Darine Abugaida. Welcome to an Al Jazeera NewsHour special, Ukraine War 1 Year On.
And I'm Adrian Finnegan, live in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, a nation that's mourning the fallen and vowing to fight on to victory. One year ago today, missiles, fighter jets and ground troops took part in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But as the war enters its second year, Ukraine, bolstered by Western support, still stands. And President Volodymyr Zelensky has pledged to win the war against Russia this year. Let's head to downtown Kyiv, where my colleague Zain Basravi is standing by. Zain, how has today been marked?
Well, this has been a somber occasion. No large-scale events, but people have been going to churches, lighting candles for loved ones lost in the fight, praying for the ones that are headed to the front line, praying for each other. One Ukrainian told me that this is not just a war that's been going on for a year or even since 2014. They feel at a very existential level that this country has been pushing back against Russian influence, against Russian aggression in one way or another for centuries. And it was a time to look back, but Ukraine's people and Ukraine's leadership is now very squarely, as the day is winding down, looking forward. President Zelensky, Volodymyr Zelensky, met the Polish Prime Minister today, who was in town, who came to visit Ukraine to mark this anniversary. Poland has, for the longest time, even since before this conflict began, been a very close ally of Ukraine's, a very hawkish European country when it comes to Russia, has been sounding the alarm for a while. The Polish leader brought with him 4 Leopard tanks, delivered them to mark the occasion of the anniversary of this war, and said 14 more, as promised, will be on the way soon. Weapons that Ukraine says it sorely needs to continue to fight Russia and to push them back and to have a victory in this conflict. You know, we've been speaking to communities all over Kyiv region, and really they just want to get back to normal. They just want peace. They just want to move on and simply exist as a country, as a sovereign nation. One of the things that communities keep telling us is that this war has been an enormous disruption to daily life. That feels like an understatement. One of the things they keep saying to us is they can't even send their children to school. They're too scared of Russian missiles and drones. Some schools have reopened with bomb shelters in the schools for the children to try to make parents feel safe enough to send their kids back to school so the education is not disrupted. We visited one school in Irpin to try to understand the reality of being a student in wartime Ukraine.
Far from the fighting, children in Ukraine are still connected to it by family members on the front line and the more immediate threat of bombs from the sky.
My children get scared when there is an air raid siren. They know what to do, they hide. But the first time my son was crying, he told me he was very scared. He thought that everyone will die and his mum was not close by. Our children do not deserve that. They should not be asking if rockets were launched or not.
Parents we met said schools, central to their community and to stability in their children's lives, were not spared in Russia's bombardments. UNICEF estimates half of all schools across Ukraine are too damaged to reopen, and 2/3 of its children are unable to access any kind of education.
Some of the schools in areas that were held by the Russians are so heavily damaged from shelling that it will take millions of dollars and years before they're ready to open for students again.
One school principal said in the aftermath of Russia's occupation of his hometown, reopening classrooms meant making sure parents felt safe enough to send their children back. With the help of international donors, this school in Irpin converted a storage basement into an air raid shelter. The plan is to build spaces like this in as many schools as possible.
The biggest concern for us is the children. They are our children, and we are responsible for them. That's why at the beginning of the school year, we organize first aid classes and psychological training to cope with fear. When we have sirens, all the children automatically come to the shelter. They know how to respond and what to do.
But it is not ideal. The student body at this school numbered in the thousands before the war. Now only 200 children attend at a time, and only for a few hours a day, because that is the maximum number of children that will fit in this shelter. School schedules made to accommodate the threat of Russian attacks. It is purpose-built to be child-friendly, but not fortified or deep enough to withstand a direct hit. Every time an air raid alarm stops and the all-clear sounds, the hope is they will never have to use it again. Zain Basravi, Al Jazeera, Irpin.
Joining me now is Violaine de Rosier, the head of operations for the International Federation of the Red Cross here in Ukraine. Good to have you with us, Violaine. What is the Red Cross doing in Ukraine right now?
So the Red Cross is providing humanitarian assistance to population across the country, in all regions of the country, primarily in health. So we have emergency health teams that are providing immediate life-saving support to population, especially in the east. We are also providing cash assistance to people to help them repair their destroyed houses or host people who host families who have lost their houses. We are also providing very basic items like hygiene kits and blankets and everything from generators to heaters for the winter. So really essential items for people to go through the difficulties that they are facing at the moment, including food and things like that.
Red Cross teams are operating right out there on the front lines at the moment. What are they telling you about conditions where the fighting is fiercest?
So the conditions are very, very difficult. They are difficult for the people on the front lines, but they're also difficult for many people also that had to flee those areas. The main needs at the moment, of course, is the emergency health needs, because there's a lot of wounded people, there's a lot of people who are traumatized. We're providing psychosocial support to these people. We're also evacuating. So far in the last year, we evacuated more than 350,000 people from those areas to take them out either to hospitals or to safe places. And so, yeah, it's ongoing on a daily basis.
Away from the front lines, there are concerns of a mental health crisis in Ukraine. What role can the Red Cross play in mitigating that?
So, you know, the Red Cross has a network of volunteers across the country. We are in every single villages in Ukraine. So there is a very wide network of volunteers that are trained to provide psychological first aid, for instance, but we also have first aid psychological support centers where people can come, they can get support from a psychologist, their kids can also have some activities. Right now we are providing support to more than 15 million people in Ukraine. And this is, we see the numbers are increasing over time.
But even if the conflict ends this year, as President Zelensky says that it will, Ukraine is going to need support for years to come, isn't it?
Yeah, so yeah, we are seeing that this war is going to go on for a long time. We are also preparing to welcome back some refugees. You know, a lot of 8.5 million people have fled the country, but 75% of those people, they want to come back. And Ukrainians have shown incredible resilience. They want to come back. They don't necessarily want to stay, even if there is a war in their country. So we are also preparing. That's the next phase of our operation here, is to see how we can support the reintegration of those people so they can go back to their homes, or if that's not possible, then we can also support them in different parts of the country.
Good to talk to you, Violaine. Many thanks indeed for being with us here on Al Jazeera. That was Violaine Desrosiers, head of operations for the International Red Cross.
Adrian, thank you so much. Well, in Russia, no major public events have been held to mark the anniversary of what President Vladimir Putin calls a special military operation. Thousands of people who opposed the conflict or wanted to avoid conscription have left. And here's what some residents of Moscow said, how they feel about the war.
My expectations? I want this to be over as soon as possible. Of course, we're waiting for Russia to win in the special military operation. The whole world's against us. NATO countries are fighting us through Ukraine, supplying them with equipment. And then there are the Nazis. We're looking forward to winning this year, hopefully. The sooner, the better for this to end.
War is, of course, bad, but this year has shown that no other decision could have been taken, and that we are defending our independence, freedom, a chance for the future of our children. Therefore, we want victory.
I really want peace. I really want it all to end as soon as possible. Too many victims, morally speaking and materially. We pensioners feel it all.
Osama bin Javed reports now from Moscow on how the nation is rallying behind President Putin.
Well, in the last year, a lot has changed. A year ago, there were sanctions almost every day being piled on Russia. Tens of thousands of people had left Russia. That included the brightest and the best that it had. But in a year, there seems to be a change of opinion. People have now come round to the narrative that has been built by the Russian government that this is an existential war. This is a war that Russia had to go to because it had no other choice, because it is fighting a coalition of countries, not just Ukraine, and it calls Ukraine a proxy army. It has been able to tell its people that in the past year that an alliance of countries came together and wanted to destroy Russia. They wanted to decapitate the Russian leadership. It's been telling its people that they have failed in breaking Russia's economy, in defeating Russia's military, or isolating Russia internationally, a proof of which is today when China has presented its peace plan, which remains a steadfast partner for Russia. So despite all of these sanctions, despite so much being pulled out of Russia, Russia has been able to withstand it. It has been able to circumvent a lot of these sanctions, and life goes on in the Russian capital as well. Although without those many recognizable international brands, those stations, those coffee shops, those cafes are still open despite them changing their names to Russian ones and ownership changing to Russia.
This Moskvich 3 is a standard 1.5-litre family car, but it comes off the production line of what used to be a Renault production plant. When the French car manufacturer left Russia last year, it wrote off $2.3 billion worth of assets and sold its Russian subsidiary for a symbolic €1. It has a buyback option in a few years if sanctions are lifted. But for now, the 45,000 workers who produce nearly a third of Russia's car market remain employed. Yet it seems one company's sanctions crisis was another's opportunity.
In 2023, we plan to produce 50,000 vehicles. 10,000 will be electric. We've already started developing our own electric platform. By the end of 2025, we plan to produce a fully electric car of our own design. We plan to localize all components in Moscow.
Fast food chains and cafes which closed operations have also been acquired by Russian business people. So McDonald's is now Vkuzno i Tochka and Starbucks is Stars Coffee in Russia.
More than 11,000 sanctions have been imposed during this year. They assumed that events would unfold in a catastrophic way. Russia's exports would go to zero. Russia would fall into a complete blockade. The financial system would collapse. However, they were wrong.
These countries have either imposed restrictions, backed sanctions, or opposed Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But the ones in green are either seen as Russia's allies or have a neutral stance. These include South America's Brazil and Venezuela, plus resource-rich nations including Iraq, Mali and Sudan, and Asia's powerhouses including India and China. This is the Kalashnikov group showcasing its weapons in the United Arab Emirates. It's one of many countries that refuse to be involved in sanctions against Russia. The Russian manufacturer produces about 95% of all small arms in the country and exports weapons to more than 27 others. Russian drug makers have turned to India's pharma industry for supplies after being blocked by the West. India has also become a major oil export market for Russia. But China dwarfs them all, with an estimated $200 billion in trade forecast with Russia by next year. Despite its allies' help, sanctions against Russia have led to a drop in exports, a widening fiscal deficit, and businesses struggling to find cash after banking restrictions. 1 year on, Moscow has proved an old military saying, Russia is never as strong as you fear, but Russia is also never as weak as you hope. Sama bin Javed, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
Well, President Vladimir Putin has framed the war as a fight for Russia's existence, and he's blamed the West for stoking the conflict. NATO, the world's largest military alliance, is standing by Ukraine with weapons and aid. And the U.S. has approved an additional $2 billion in military aid on the anniversary of the start of the war, along with more sweeping sanctions. Patty Culhane reports from Washington.
A day after this began, the U.S. president asked Congress for $3.5 billion in military aid for Ukraine. A year later, the amount has increased almost tenfold. In the beginning, the U.S. provided Stinger anti-aircraft systems and Javelins anti-armor systems, portable, easy-to-use weapons designed to target planes and tanks. But as the months have passed and the battle lines have shifted, analysts say a pattern has emerged.
The Biden administration has taken an iterative approach, building on past deliveries to Ukraine, testing the waters, seeing the reaction both from the international community and Russia, and then escalating the sophistication and volume of assistance from there.
Over the course of the year, the U.S. has continued to supply Stingers and Javelins, adding in Switchblades, known as suicide drones, and howitzers, basically mobile cannons, and the rounds that go with it. They've provided air defense systems, NASAMS, which is for shorter to medium range intercepts, and also the Patriot defense system, which is meant for longer range intercepts. They've provided HIMARS, that is a GPS guided rocket system that has allowed the Ukrainians to target Russians further from the front lines. And now Abrams tanks, although the Pentagon says they're having those built, along with training that likely means they won't be on the battlefield anytime soon. It's a long list that the U.S. continues to add to, each time U.S. officials debating and assessing if it will cross Russia's red line, which some Russian experts say could happen if Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, thinks he's losing.
One of the things that Russia could do is to take out, one or more of the satellites that allow Ukraine to use this precision-guided munition arsenal effectively. Those satellites are in fact vulnerable, and there are a lot of things that the Russians could do to interfere with them, and that would certainly be a dangerous escalatory step.
A year in, the Ukrainians are asking for longer-range weapons and fighter jets. So far, President Joe Biden has been clear on his answer.
Will the United States provide F-16s to Ukraine?
No. An answer he's given before. The Ukrainians hoping once again they can help change his mind. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Let's now cross over to Moscow. We're going to speak to Pavel Falkenhauer, who's an independent defense analyst, joining us from there. Mr. Falkenhauer, welcome to Al Jazeera. So as Western countries pledge more and more military aid to Ukraine, from a military standpoint, what's your analysis of where the war will head to next as it enters its second year?
Well, this is right now a bloody stalemate there. The front line has not changed much in the last several months after the Russian forces withdrew from the right bank of the Dnipro River and abandoned Kherson, which was a very important move because that meant that the Russian forces, the Russian command, had basically forsaken any possibility of any major strategic offensive. for the time being. They cannot move to the Dniester or never any other place because they're now only on the left bank of the Dnipro. So this is, since then, it's a stalemate situation, pitched battles around Bakhmut and other places in Donbass with very slow progress.
Right, and speaking of the Donbass, let me ask you, I mean, will Russia manage to hold on to the areas that it's captured and expand its control? Obviously, the Donbass region is important for Russia, and Putin has prioritized, as he says, liberating the whole of Donbass.
Well, yes, politically it's very important. Militarily, right now, these battles are not significant in themselves. I mean, the places they're fighting for, like Bakhmut, does not have any real strategic value in itself, but it's important psychologically. And it seems that the Russian idea, the strategy is to exhaust the Ukrainian forces, exhaust the Ukrainian nation, break their morale, their desire and capability to fight on. Apparently, the Kremlin believes that the Russian people have more will and more manpower, actually.
Yeah,
and
so that's the thing. I mean, despite Moscow having had more soldiers, more weapons, and more aircraft, why do you think that it hasn't secured a decisive win over Kyiv yet?
Well, there was apparently a very serious mistake in calculation of how the Ukraine will resist, how the Ukrainian military can fight. And that happened already a year ago, basically in the first 2 weeks of the conflict. The Russian blitz faltered. And since then, it's been a war of attrition. So now the Russian leadership believes they can win a war of attrition, that the West is going to get tired of this war and supporting Ukraine. The Ukrainian military will be exhausted. The Ukrainian people will lose their desire to fight. And in the end, Russia will be successful.
And
that seems to be the...
Operating alongside the Russian military has been the mercenary private Wagner group. To what extent did their involvement aid Russian advances?
Well, they have been used as frontline crack stormtroops. That's how they were used actually in Syria, but in much less numbers. In Syria, because the Russians were bombing and the Syrian government forces should have gone forward, but didn't, and so they deployed the Wagners. Now the same is happening in the Donbass. The Russian regulars apparently are not ready to go and die in such numbers as the Wagners, which are sending in actually felons who volunteered to go out of prison for a pardon, and they are ready to fight this bloody battle. But the existence of such a private army within the Russian ranks, well, that demonstrates problems within the Russian regular military.
All right, on that note, we'll have to leave it there. We thank you so much for joining us from Moscow.
Thank you.
Now, Russia's invasion has turned the focus on its billionaires. Those with close links to President Putin and the Kremlin have been hit with sweeping international sanctions, their property and assets frozen and seized. The British capital, London, was once regarded as a favorite playground of the Russian elite. Paul Brennan looks at what they're doing now.
For Russia's post-Soviet millionaires, the white stucco mansions of London's Belgravia were an irresistible magnet. Awash with Russian money, districts like Mayfair, Belgravia and Knightsbridge earned the nickname Londongrad. The exclusive prime real estate agents of London's Mayfair rode that boom, brokering billions in property deals. But in the past year, international sanctions have brought an end to all that.
All doors have come down in terms of Russians. Very difficult to work with Russians because neither banks nor lawyers are keen to work with them. Some agents won't work with them. But it doesn't really matter because there have been very few, if any, Russian inquiries over the last 8 or 10 months.
The invasion of Ukraine sparked a scramble for the exit. Realizing that sanctions were imminent and inevitable, the oligarchs raced to offload their assets, get rid of their football clubs and sail their motor yachts out of the reach of the sanctioning authorities. Londongrad had become a hostile environment for Russian money. The shutters came down. In Europe and the United States, law enforcement has been vigorously seizing billions in Russian-linked assets, while new disclosure laws are revealing the true ownership of thousands of anonymous offshore holding companies. The anti-corruption group, the OCCRP, has compiled a Russian asset tracker, meticulously listing the yachts, the mansions and the private jets of many of the best-known Russian elite. The group says sanctions have meant these billionaires are now struggling to find lawyers and financiers willing to work for them. But these are resourceful people.
They really do have this oligarch survival kit that includes, multiple citizenships, passports, dummy companies, lots of proxies, lots of digital assets sometimes, lots of art and so on. And even if we look at Europe, for instance, the UK or Switzerland or other countries where that were preferred by oligarchs for a long time, we see that the action against these oligarchs is barely touching the surface.
Places like Dubai and Turkey remain neutral and are not imposing sanctions. This $250 million super yacht linked to the sanctioned oligarch Andrei Scotch was just one of those spotted in Dubai harbour. Eclipse and Solaris, two of Roman Abramovich's yachts, are off Turkey. A year on from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, at least $2 billion of assets have been frozen in the UK alone. But although London is now off limits, the sheer scale of the oligarch's wealth means that may amount to no more than an inconvenience. Paul Brennan, Al Jazeera, Belgravia.
Well, Palestinians have criticized what they say are double standards in Western powers' attitudes to invasion and occupation. Many say the international community has rushed to sanction Russia for its war in Ukraine, but they argue they've lived under military occupation for decades without Israel being held to account. Nida Ibrahim reports from the occupied West Bank.
Svetlana Khadr has lived under Israel's military occupation for the last 30 years. A Ukrainian who married a Palestinian, she now lives in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. In February last year, her original hometown of Mariupol also became occupied by Russian forces. Svetlana says she never thought in her life that Palestine would be a refuge for her family. But after her brother was killed in the war in Ukraine last year, it is where her 80-year-old mother fled to.
It's your right to live in peace and for your children to see freedom. No one should take your right away. This is what the Russians are doing to Ukrainians, taking our right. So there are lots of similarities between Palestinians and Ukrainians.
Despite being under the military rule of a foreign power, Palestinians say the world is ignoring their situation.
Palestinians say that their struggle for independence and freedom is a just cause. Victims of a decades-long occupation, they say they can't count on the international community, which rushed to sanction Russia while allowing Israel to get away with its violations.
I feel very angered at the double standards of the European and the Western nations where they've been taking the wrong side of history against Palestinians all these years.
The world is showing sympathy with Ukraine, but diminishes us. The world only respects the powerful.
The big powers who rule the world have double standards. It seems that those who control international law decide who abides by it.
Dozens of UN resolutions support the Palestinian people's right to independence and self-determination and designate settlements illegal. But none have led to action. Palestinian officials say this shows double standards, and it's not new.
The problem is that countries are not willing to uphold international standards when it comes to Israel and international human rights law, and to apply the same exact measures that they apply elsewhere in the world. And this is why we continue to witness Israel's non-abidance by international law.
Like most Palestinians, Svetlana says the war in Ukraine is devastating, but hopes it will end soon. But she and many Palestinians fear Israel's occupation will go on much longer. Nida Ibrahim, Al Jazeera, the occupied West Bank.
Well, I'm joined now by Marwan Bishara. He's Al Jazeera's senior political analyst here in Doha. Welcome back, Marwan. So how do we explain this double standards? And also, when you say that this war has exposed the limits and outright failure of the international system. Where does that failure lie?
Well, exactly in the hypocrisy of superpowers, because the superpowers, like the United States and Russia, basically control the world system. They have veto power at the United Nations Security Council and cripple the United Nations and undermine the application of international law, whether it is in the Middle East or in Ukraine, whether it's in Palestine or elsewhere. And in a sense, Russia chose a war of choice in Ukraine. It's a horrific, disastrous war. And on the other hand, there is this breathtaking Western hypocrisy, because the West, the United States, claims that this is a war of democracy against dictatorship, while at the same time the United States and its European allies support numerous dictatorships around the world. And then they turn and say, well, it's actually about the respect for sovereignty. But it's the United States that violated Iraqi sovereignty and other countries' sovereignties. And then they turn and say Russia has no right to annex Ukrainian territories. But it's the United States that recognized Israel's annexation of Syrian and Palestinian territories. So the hypocrisy is breathtaking, in as much as the Russian war itself is horrific.
And Marwan, one of the main reasons of this war, according to Moscow, of course, is NATO's expansionist ambitions into Europe. NATO, of course, led by the United States. But so far, what we've seen is that NATO has remained just as defiant as Russia has.
Absolutely.
So what does this mean as to what happens next?
There's no doubt that Russia used the issue of NATO wanting to expand to the Russian borders, meaning to Ukraine, as a pretext for war. But the war is war, and it's a war of choice, not a war of defense. It's a war of choice. And yet, since 2008, I was there in Bucharest when it was discussed that NATO would expand to Georgia and Ukraine. The French and the Germans said, no, we shouldn't. This will destabilize European security. It's a no-go. And it was postponed after Bucharest. But then after 2014 and later in 2018, it was revisited again and again that it should be expanded. The Russians gave the West, the NATO, an ultimatum. They said, if you do, and if you don't clear out of our borders, something horrible is going to happen. And it did happen. So when it comes to this sort of question of European security, the media, especially the Western media, tends to be, I don't want to say foolish, but certainly ahistorical. Because when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, and European security, we're not talking about few years' history. We're talking about centuries of history. So it's not just about dictatorships and democracy, or just about sovereignty, or just about annexation, or just about security. It's also about Europe and its horrific history of conflict that does include the Polish and the Ukrainians and the Russians and the French and others.
Of course, Marwan, there are other countries in Africa, for example, and also in Asia that don't support Western countries in their condemnation of Russia, and they don't agree with the UN on sort of pressuring Russia. So going forward, do you think that these divisions are going to deepen?
Well, it's kind of hybrid, right? So at the United Nations, they vote for the withdrawal, Russian withdrawal from Ukraine. But in real life, they still trade with Russia, get arms from Russia, support Russia in various ways. Just like when the United States and Israel are only few or five that support certain or against certain resolution, and the rest of the world is against, but then they trade with the United States and have security agreements with Israel. It's a very hybrid, hypocritical world in some ways. But I'll tell you what is really interesting is what happened today with China. Right?
Which I wanted to actually ask you about the Chinese peace proposal and what you think of that.
It's really amazing, because when I heard the press conference, right, with NATO Secretary General, with the Estonia Prime Minister, and so on and so forth, they were saying, no, we should not, because China has close relationship with Russia. And China could not be trusted because it did not take a fundamental position. It has limitless relation with Russia. It's those same countries, the United States and European powers, that insist that only the United States can mediate peace in the Middle East when it has limitless, unconditional support for Israel. Hypocrisy is just breathtaking once and again. I think China should be taken seriously. It's the only superpower with leverage with Moscow, and hence it could pressure Russia into a ceasefire and perhaps into going to before February 22nd, 2022. And we could see the beginning of an end to this horrific, disastrous war. The fact that Western powers are rejecting it out of hand, that does not serve the cause of peace. What it does now, it will simply prolong the war for God knows when.
Okay, Marwan, thank you so much for that analysis. Well, it's now back to you, Adrian, in Kyiv.
Doreen, as the war grinds on, millions of Ukrainian families remain separated. Poland has welcomed the most, with around 1.5 million people settling there. Al Jazeera's Jonah Hull met some refugees there who hope to return to their homeland one day.
In a Polish auditorium, Ukrainian refugees watch a film comparing the World War II destruction of Warsaw with last year's Russian bombardment of Mariupol. Warsaw was rebuilt and rose shiny and new from the ashes. So too, the thinking goes, will Ukraine's devastated cities like Mariupol. On a guided tour of Warsaw later, where traces of the war still remain, some feel only faint hope.
Тот Мариуполь уже никогда не будет тем.
The Mariupol we had will never be the same. It'll be different. We cannot know how, but the life we had there will never return. That life was stolen from us.
Hope is a common ingredient in the lives of Ukrainian refugees scattered the world over, a large proportion benefiting from the generosity of neighbouring Poland. But the warmth and safety of sponsored accommodation is no barrier to pain.
March 20th was a more or less quiet day, so we left the basement. And I remember it was my daughter's birthday.
Nor to the realization that what began as a temporary relocation could last much longer. And while there are those returning to safer parts of Ukraine, especially as winter lifts, many continue to flee the fighting in the south and east. Trainloads of newcomers arrive on Poland's eastern border almost every day.
We sold everything just to have money to come across.
You sold all your belongings?
Yeah, even books. It was too hard. And here, only my mom.
Since the war began, more than 8 million people have disembarked trains like this one from Ukraine, many of them going on to settle in countries all over the world, while Poland alone has taken in around 1.5 million, and this country's generosity now being sorely tested as the war goes on. In recent years, Poland has become infamous for its unwelcoming attitude to migrants from Africa and the Middle East trying to cross the border from Belarus. Not so those from Ukraine. But while the country spends billions of dollars supporting them, and as the cost of living soars, the hope that they'll one day be able to leave Poland is not felt by the Ukrainians alone.
And Jonah joins us now live at a UN community centre for refugees near the Polish-Ukrainian border. Jonah.
Yeah, you know, people are still arriving here every single day crossing the border from Ukraine. The estimate is around 2,000 people per day. Remember, people are going the other way too. Around 1,000 per day are returning to safer parts of Ukraine. And just an hour or so ago, the train arrived, the same one you saw in my report there from Zaporizhia, another train load coming in, some of them ending up in this shelter. It's in fact run by Ukrainian House, the cultural institution based here in Poland. And joining me from Ukrainian House is Tatiana Nokonyishna. Thank you so much for joining us, Tanya. It's not the huge numbers of the beginning of the war, obviously, but still they come.
Yes, people are coming. As you said, when you go to the train station, you see as much as 2,000 people coming every day only by train, and that's why we have on the train station we have our employees, our volunteers working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because they are needed there. And that's why here in this shelter we have people all the time. We have refugees, we receive refugees here. We have 50 sleeping places. People can stay 1 to 3 nights as long as it takes. So yeah, we have
you just keep doing it. You've been doing it since the beginning. You're part of this army of volunteers, NGOs, other institutions, seeing this unending sort of flow of misery and despair. It can't be easy for you. How do you cope?
It's not easy. It's not easy for all of us, actually. But, you know, I have this feeling.
You're much in need.
Yes.
You have this feeling.
I have this feeling that this day started a year ago, on 24th of February 2022, and it still has not ended. So that's why we do not have really time to think about what we see, how we feel. But actually, yes, you are right. We saw so much misery, so much unhappiness.
And still it goes on. One fascinating aspect I just want to touch on is that this place, Przemyśl, on the border, was the scene after the Second World War of the most appalling bloodletting between Ukrainian nationalists and Poles. Thousands upon thousands died. Has this war had the effect of bringing Ukrainians and Poles together again?
Absolutely, yes. The history of our nations is very difficult, especially here in Przemyśl. However, when this whole thing started, we did not look who is who. We just worked together, and I have this feeling that from now on we are writing new history. I mean, in some time, in 10, 50, 100 years, we will talk about completely different history, and we will not remember what happened 100 years ago or 80 years ago. We will talk about what's happening between our two nations now, and this is very, very important.
Fascinating. Tanya, thank you so much for joining us. So one unintended consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a new chapter of history being written between Ukrainians and Poles. Adrian, back to you.
Jonah, many thanks indeed. Jonah Hull there, live near the Polish-Ukrainian border. Let's bring in the UNHCR now. We have Kevin Allen, who's the country representative for Poland at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. He is in Warsaw. Kevin, good to have you with us. What are the UNHCR's priorities right now in Poland?
Well, first and foremost, Adrian, I want to thank you for welcoming me and to acknowledge the incredible solidarity of Poland. You were just speaking with some of the volunteers and the humanitarian workers on the border regions. And I think one of the first priorities for UNHCR and our partners is to continue standing firm with the Ukrainian refugees in this uncertain situation, and at the same time to stand firm with Poland, given its really remarkable hospitality and solidarity in this context. But I also think it's incumbent that we note the importance of ending the destruction in the senseless killing in Ukraine, which continues to drive, as you've noted, displacement. There's currently 5 million people displaced, forced from their homes within Ukraine, and 8 million people have crossed the border into Europe. About half of those have gone through Poland. And at this juncture, we note that a lot of refugees, the 1.5 million who have registered here in Poland, are doing okay in the sense that they have access to healthcare, access to education, they're able to work, but at the same time, 90% of them are women and children. So you have inherent vulnerabilities that exist. You also have a large number of people who've experienced severe psychosocial trauma during flight. You have an important number of elderly refugees, also disabled persons. So notwithstanding the exemplary solidarity, really, of the people of Poland, there are still needs, and we need to continue to stand firmly with the refugees, but also with Poland as a host country. At the same time, we know that this is not over. The longer term looms, and the future is not clear. In recent surveys that we have done, around 80% of refugees say they would like to go home. They'd like to go back to Ukraine. But the single biggest deterrent, the reason that most of them are not doing that and are not willing to go back significant numbers is the ongoing conflict, Kevin, which brings us back to that initial notion
Kevin?
That we really need to stop the senseless killing and destruction in Ukraine.
Kevin, I don't know whether you can hear me, Kevin. We're running out of time here. I just want to get this question in. Most of the Ukrainians in Poland right now are women and children. In terms of education, what needs to be provided? If you can give me a reasonably succinct answer. Thank you.
Fortunately, the government of Poland has opened schools to Ukrainian children. They're able to go and study alongside Polish children. It's important that we continue to work with the community to ensure that children enroll, that they take advantage of that opportunity. Some children are in online curriculum with Ukrainian language, studying in Ukraine. From our vantage point, it's also important that they go to school, that they're physically in school. But the government of Poland has provided that opportunity to all Ukrainian refugees.
Kevin, really appreciate you coming on. Many thanks indeed. Kevin Allen there with the UN Refugee Agency in Poland. Now, many Ukrainians have returned to their homes since those initial weeks of the war, but for those who fled from regions that are still under Russian control, that kind of homecoming is harder to imagine. As Willem Marks reports now from the UK.
Olesia Sidorenko had been saving money for months to take her 2 sons on an overseas vacation. She never imagined it would fund their escape from a war zone.
I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, 24th of February, when I heard terrible explosion.
For days, she slept beneath the bombardments in a nearby hospital basement with 8-year-old Nikita and 14-year-old Artem. 2 months on, the teenager told her he'd had enough.
He started to cry one day and said to me, how much money we need to leave the Ukraine.
She spent a small fortune travelling to Crimea, further inside Russian-occupied territory, then on to Georgia, Turkey, and eventually the English town of Worthing, part of a wave of Ukrainians welcomed to the UK under a government resettlement programme.
In the months that followed the February invasion, tens of thousands of British families of all different backgrounds, whether based in remote villages in the far north of Scotland or coastal communities like this one on the southern edge of England, volunteered to host Ukrainians in their homes.
Among them was retiree Janet Atkinson, who says she felt she had to help out however she could and offered her home up for Olesia's first 6 months.
I think the most rewarding part is that they feel safe here, and it's nice.
The challenge now, 9 months later and without government support, is to find affordable housing close enough for Olesia's 2 sons to stay at their current schools.
Well, I can't put them through the turmoil of social housing, which may not even be in Worthing. So I offered another 6 months. But I think it has to be finite, and for their sake as well as mine. They need to make their own lives.
For young Artem, that life includes art, now on display in a local gallery. What's this one?
M4.
He's selling these cardboard sculptures to raise money for Ukraine's army.
Щоб захищати нашу країну.
They want to liberate Ukraine.
Yes.
Guns this past year became a part of many Ukrainian children's lives. Now perhaps a key to a future return home.
Yes.
Willem Marks, Al Jazeera, Worthing, Southern England.
And for the moment, that's all from me in Kyiv. Back to you in Doha, Tareen.
Adrian, thank you. Well, dozens of independent journalists have escaped a media crackdown in Russia. Step Vasson met some of them in Amsterdam.
They were in silence for very long. TV Rain or Dost is again reaching out to its Russian audience, now from Amsterdam. The independent channel was banned in Russia 1 week after the invasion of Ukraine for its coverage of the war. Like hundreds of other journalists, presenter Mikhail Fishman and Julia Taratuta fled Russia out of fear of arrest.
Prominent voices are silenced. Either they are in jail or they are put in a position when they basically can't open their mouth.
Since its escape from Russia, TV Rain's audience has grown with nearly 4 million subscribers and hundreds of thousands of views each day.
This fight
is very difficult for us, and because you have to understand that the annual budget of Russian state SME, so propagandist SME, more than €1 billion, and the combined budget of 31 Russian media in exile is just €6.2 million. We are like David and Goliath.
While originally an English-language newspaper, the Moscow Times has increased its readership by also publishing in Russian. Amsterdam has become a new home for Russian media in exile. The Moscow Times was forced to leave the country it was operating in for nearly 30 years. Its sudden departure shows how journalism and press freedom are among the victims of this war, not only in Russia, but some say in Western Europe as well.
This is RT International.
When the European Union decided to ban Kremlin-backed media, Russia Today and Sputnik, a few months into the war, the Dutch Federation for Journalists formally filed a complaint.
What we see on RT or Sputnik, we consider also as propaganda and as not being independent journalism. But at the same time, we feel that it's very worrisome if a state, if the political leadership can decide on what people in European countries can see or not can see.
In Russia, journalists risk 15 years in prison just for using the word war.
Its military part has completely failed, but its inner propaganda part is succeeding. We have to admit that. Because this enemy is much weaker and easier to crush.
Meanwhile, TV Rain fights hard to stay on air, offering a different narrative to its Russian audience. The channel was recently banned in Latvia for comments that were considered pro-Russian. The channel is fighting that decision. Stepfasen, Al Jazeera, Amsterdam.
Well, let's now bring in Ekaterina Kotrikadze. She's the news director and anchor at the independent Russian television channel TV Rain that we just saw in the report. And she's joining us from Georgia's capital, Tbilisi. Thanks for speaking to us. So it's not really a surprise that some governments will try to secure the public narrative during times of war. 1 year on, do you think the Kremlin is winning or is it losing control of the narrative in Russia?
It's hard to say because there is a military censorship, as my colleague has just mentioned, in Russian Federation. You don't know what the feelings of the society are right now. What we can definitely know is that even state-controlled polling stations are admitting that the level of support of this war is going down and down step by step, because this war is coming to the homes of a lot of Russians, of millions of Russians, because people are being mobilized to go to the war. So there are people who were above the politics, if you can say so, before that. But right now they are forced to understand what is really going on in Ukraine.
And of course, as we just saw in the report, your channel TV Rain, considered to be one of the last independent TV stations in Russia, survived just 1 week after the war started, forcing you to relaunch from Latvia. And then more recently, Latvia canceled your license, branding the company a threat to national security. I mean, how does all of this impact your coverage of the war?
It does not impact anyhow. I mean, the fact that we were banned from Russia and we were forced to flee the country, this is important. Unfortunately, I am in Tbilisi, Georgia, right now, reporting from here at this terrible anniversary, 1 year of war. My colleagues are in Riga. Some of them are in Amsterdam. Some of them are in other parts of the world. What we know is that we need to keep on working. We know that we have millions of viewers. We have 14 million unique viewers only on YouTube monthly, only from Russia. What I'm saying is that we can see that people need us. We know that there is a terrible war crimes and crimes against humanity being committed right now in Ukraine. We need to report about that. And we have a huge audience. And it doesn't matter what happened in Latvia. We're going to be fine. We will move to Amsterdam. So it's not going to be a problem for me.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for speaking to us from Tbilisi. So in the fog of war, propaganda is often used as a tool. And during Russia's war in Ukraine, it's come in many forms. Laura Khan reports.
Propaganda, often at the front and centre of shoring up support for a nation at war, and Russia is no exception. These symbols of its war in Ukraine can be found even outside of schools.
When war started, propaganda increased. Media use only 100% politically correct words like Ukrainians, Kyiv, maximum they're calling Kiev government, the Kiev regime.
Analysts say Ukraine's strategy often appeals on an emotional level. And central to this is President Volodymyr Zelensky, often depicted as a figurehead of bravery and resilience.
Ukraine cannot engage and doesn't have enough resources actually to engage in, at the same level of propaganda campaign as Russia.
Tokarczuk points out that many campaigns are led by civil rights groups, some with humour. But it's on social media platforms that disinformation is flourishing. Last year, this deep fake of Zelensky calling on soldiers to lay down weapons was reportedly uploaded to a hacked website. And game developer Bohemia Interactive released a statement after a video from its game Arma 3 was falsely shared as a war video. Now, journalists and experts are trained in how to distinguish between real combat videos and video games like Arma 3. In a statement, Bohemia Interactive set out how the public can spot a fake, and the red flags include a low screen resolution, a darker screen to hide some of those details, and strange particle effects, as it's very difficult to depict smoke, fire and dust in video games. Online platforms have also been moving to ban Kremlin-backed state media. Tech giants like YouTube and Meta announced they would ban Russia Today and Sputnik, which then shifted contents to alt-tech platforms, Gab, Rumble and Odyssey. They're popular among the far right, having been established to evade big tech censorship. And US-based intelligence firm Nisos traced video being shared on Telegram and Twitter from inauthentic accounts, linking many to Russian media, ministries or officials. Russia's representative to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, recently accused Western countries of conducting an anti-Russia propaganda campaign. With so much disinformation and conflicting narratives, truth can be a casualty when rallying support takes precedence. Laura Khan, Al Jazeera.
Well, that's it from myself and the team in Ukraine, but we'll be back on Saturday at these times looking at what's next for Ukraine, Russia, NATO, and the wider world. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye for now.